Okay, so let's get started. So next week is going to be the midterm, and so I told you, you got 3 hours, so it'll be exactly the same time. Just come at 9:10, and then you have 3 hours to finish. And you don't have to finish, use all 3 hours to finish your exam. And it would be basically everything until Pareto optimality we covered today. We're going to cover today. And of course, today, I think we should have enough time for a review over the materials from the very beginning of the class, and also to take a look at the mock exam questions if you have any questions with them. And also, I have posted a solution guide on the course website, so please take a look. And I'll also explain that a little bit. I mean, this is almost like the question that I would include every time, because this is quite a useful quiz to tell the differences among students. And also there are some tricky parts in that exam as well. So I would go through, and if you have questions, please let me know. All right, so that's about next week, and let's maybe talk about all the issues with the or the questions with the midterm in the third hour. So let's finish the course materials for the first 2 hours. Okay, so we haven't finished the topic on dictatorships, but we have covered well 这个 OK， 但这个好像最好，我不知道为什么。对，那这个你要拿回去吧。好。All right. Well, this one is better. Okay, so dictatorships. There's some concepts that we have talked about last semester, so I don't want to, of course, repeat those. But just a quick reminder, especially there are some people who didn't take my class last semester. So just very quick overview of the concepts. So last week, basically, it's about selective theory, and which is a very popular tool we use for analyzing dictatorships, and especially the differences in the level of public goods provision across dictatorships, right? So since this is about, in comparative politics of dictatorships. So in other words, we want to compare different dictatorships, and there are different levels of public goods provision, and the selective theory provides some useful concept for that. But also, from last semester, if you remember, when we explained, especially the regime, I think that was the topic about regime in the state. So we said there are, different types of regimes in the world, especially the big divide is between democracy and dictatorships. And one of the very recent concepts that people use is this semi-democratic institutions. And the reason is, if you look at a lot of different dictatorships, they seem to share one thing in common, which is they also have legislatures, parties, and elections. And so a lot of scholars started trying to explain why they have all these seemingly democratic institutions, even though they are not democratic, because even though they have elections, those elections are not necessarily very competitive. And even though they have legislatures, but some of the legislatures are actually just rubber stamps, right? So for example, like China's People's Congress, you wouldn't say it's a pure rubber stamp, but it doesn't actually have the power, all the powers that we talk about for democratic legislatures. And they have parties, but the thing is, there's probably only one party that is in power, which is, for example, in China, that's the Chinese Communist Party. And in other dictatorships as well, they have their own parties. So in our literature, we mentioned, for example, the effects of authoritarian institutions, and we talk about self-enforcing power sharing, and we actually spend some time explaining what that means. We will come back to the concept actually next, probably the week after next week. But for now, let's not dig into that. And also the stability of authoritarian institutions actually counts on the power balance between elites, because there's always an issue why dictators and political elites inside a dictatorship will be willing to honor these contracts, political contracts among them. So, and then we use Jason Brownlee's book as case study, right? Because in his book, he compared two sets of countries, Egypt and Malaysia as one group versus Iran and the Philippines as the other group. And well, Jason found that, well, regime endurance has something to do with, or a lot to do with the institutionalization of their authoritarian politics in these two countries. And therefore, that's a key distinction he makes in the book about these two sets of countries. But for today, I want to extend that logic to include media freedom as well. And also, we mentioned media freedom last semester as a motivation for several weeks. And I think I might also touch upon this already, that we have also seen a great variation in terms of the levels of media freedom across dictatorships. So in other words, some dictators allow for more media freedom for their media outlets, while others don't. And again, the puzzle is always the why. Why you have some dictatorships that are willing to do this? And so the concept actually could be very similar. And then, first of all, inheriting from the concepts we just talked about. For example, this paper by Bosch and Spalik, they talk about authoritarian institutions as a transparency creating mechanism between dictators and their constituents. And this is the concept we talked about last semester. Because of this transparency, it helps bring some kind of trust between the dictators and their allies in a winning coalition. Well, this is something, of course, we didn't talk about from the selective theory part, right? Because in the selective theory part, we simply focus on effects of loyalty. And also, of course, especially the ratio between W and S, right? The size of the winning coalition and the size of the selectorate. So that ratio is the key prediction or the key predictor from the selective theory. But we never talk about, the origin of this and why you have, in some countries, higher level of trust among dictators and their allies, and why some don't have this, right? And therefore, this subject about media freedom I'm going to talk to you about is actually the direct answer to this question. And the thing is, media freedom, as a matter of fact, could be another institutional condition for transparency, because when Bosch and Spalik, when they wrote that paper in 2013, when they talk about transparency, their idea is that inside those institutions, for example, inside the People's of Congress, even though the information certainly is not very transparent for outsiders, right? So for ordinary Chinese citizens, they might not know too much about what's going on inside the Congress. But for people inside the Congress or further inside the Politburo, they obviously would have a lot more information compared to other people outside the regime, right? But that's, so in other words, you have two different distinctions here. One is the distinction between ordinary citizens and political elites. But there's a second distinction, which is the distinction inside the winning coalition. And therefore, the transparency they talk about is about the second distinction. So in other words, if they are both members of the People's Congress or the Politburo members, they will be shared with much more information. So that's what they are talking about. But the thing is, what we found, actually, this is based on one of the papers I wrote about 2 years ago. But as a matter of fact, we also found that the source of information that leads to the transparency is not just from, the power sharing inside the winning coalition. It's also about the media freedom, because the information floated around on the media could also be used as a very useful information for elites when they want to build this trust. And therefore, we went out to collect data and then show that, as a matter of fact, media freedom can also be viewed as another institutional condition. And to quote another very famous paper by Agraf and others, So this paper, of course, it's a little bit old. It was published in 2009. Well, but the thing is, Egorov, as you can tell by the name, is Russian, but working in the United States. And so there's these kind of Russian scholars, they went back to Russian history and found that, well, actually, during the final years under Gorbachev, Gorbachev was actually extremely eager to open up. And the reason is not because he necessarily loved freedom or democracy, but it's out of a very practical reason. And here is a quote from that paper. So, which is Gorbachev wishes he could buy a Kremlin equivalent of the Washington Post and find out what is going on in his socialist wonderland. So in other words, this is of course another angle you can take to look at a country like China's, right? So in other words, I mean, all these dictators, of course, they are extremely powerful in terms of controlling the country, but that doesn't mean they are necessarily equally powerful in gathering information. And therefore, media freedom or media outlets themselves could serve this purpose if they open it up. And therefore, well, this is just a kind of motivation to help you understand. So even in the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev was the top leader of the Soviet Union, and of course supposedly controlled a lot of apparatus of the Soviet Union, right, to get information, but still he would eager to have this Kremlin equivalent of the Washington Post. And this is to tell you, of course, during that era of Cold War, with competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, in the US, it's not, of course, a dictatorship, it's a democracy, and it's a freedom of speech. And then there are lots of different media outlets in the United States offering information to people. And obviously, even Gorbachev, the top leader of the Soviet Union back then, was willing to admit this is a much more powerful tool for the leader to get information. All right? And therefore, this is, well, in a way, to motivate this research about media freedom. And the reason is media freedom can help some dictators to do this. All right. And then, but again, from the very beginning, I said, of course, this is a way to justify their quest for media, for information, and therefore use media freedom as a tool for get more information. So it's kind of instrumental, right? But still, not all the countries, not all the dictators, they're willing to adopt this policy. So why there's such a difference? And then we argue this has something to do with the power sharing, levels of power sharing inside a dictatorship. So in other words, if you want to connect what I'm talking about now and the topic we talked about last week, the selector theory. So this is to tell you, last week, when we introduced this idea, the levels of public goods provision can be determined by the ratio of W over S. We didn't talk about, right, the origin, as I said, origin of, why some countries have bigger S, why some countries have bigger W, right? And this is a way to kind of supplement that part of the analysis. So it's somehow because the structure of politics in these different dictatorships. So some countries, they are more personalist. In other words, the power is concentrated much more in the hands of a dictator. So we, of course, use South Korea as an example of that for quite a few times. And China before was described not as a personalist regime, but more of a party-based regime. So in other words, inside the regime, actually, the top leaders had to share power with other political elites as well. So in other words, that's not personalism. But we argue that if this regime is very personalist, then and therefore there's lower level of power sharing, the leader actually doesn't have to have media freedom because this guy doesn't have to share information with other people. There aren't that many other people out there, right? So in other words, the W is very small in this case when you have a personalist regime. But if you have a larger winning coalition, so just like China before Xi Jinping, then you have a more power sharing in that kind of region, and therefore you need media freedom as a way to build trust between the dictator and other elites. That is inside the winning coalition. So that's kind of the argument. So, and therefore, the hypothesis here is that media freedom decreases with the level of personalist rule under dictatorships. And this is a total kind of empirical pursuit. And therefore, I will show you how we did it. So, for example, before we kind of dive into the more kind of statistical part of the analysis, well, you can just take the data from Freedom House reports, for example. So, if you, for example, take China, the freedom of the press in China from 2007 to 2016, well, there's actually a very clear divide. And during the Hu Jintao era, even though, of course, the score for China has been low, because, kind of very consistently, actually, over time. But during Hu Jintao, you have some fluctuations, but at least it remained roughly before, above the level of 15. But under Xi Jinping era, well, the score actually took a dive, right? It dropped all the way from 17 to 13. So in other words, the intuition based on the reasons I provided from the previous slide is that that's because Xi Jinping is personalizing the regime. So he was purging his political enemies outside the party, and therefore the kind of power sharing structure China used to have now didn't exist, right? And that's why, to fit that theory, that's why the media freedom score decreases, and it's because during the Xi Jinping era, there is some kind of personalism going on. And of course, until today, it's almost like finished. So all the powers that used to be shared among elites now have been taken to the hands of Xi Jinping. So that's I use this as a way to illustrate that idea. And also it's pretty straightforward. But again, if we just focus on China, that might not be that convincing, right? But because, how do we know about other details, right? And therefore, we actually did a very comprehensive test on this by collecting data from all the dictatorships, and just quickly go over how we construct a personalism indicator. And this is actually a continuous variable from a recent contribution by Gerrit, Wright, and friends. So they constructed this variables for almost all the dictators. So for them, personalist rule indicates that the dictator has personal discretion and control over the key levers of power in his political system. And accordingly, dictators' policy choices are relatively unconstrained by the institutions and are powerful relative to other members of the elites. So this is exactly what we have been talking about for quite a while, right? So this is the kind of personalism that is going on. Or as I said, in China, maybe the process has been finished. And in the data set, the higher value of personalism indicates more power sharing between dictators and elites. But that's just a detail about the data set. And of course, this is obviously much advanced material. So I will just show you this scalar plots that we have. And of course, the thing is, I can share with you more details if you're willing to spend some time on this. But for now, in the class, I just want to show you. This is also a very clear trend. So we collect all the data and then, of course, line up all these regimes according to their scores of personalism. As you can see here, and of course, the y-axis is the media freedom. So if you remember last semester, we also used one of this kind of scatter plot from Agarov's paper. But what they want to show is something different, right? Because they want to show is y still is media freedom, but the x-axis is the policy score. In other words, how democratic a country is. So, but this is the same kind of scatter plot, but with different variables. The y variable is the same, but x variable is different. And so it's very clear from the picture on the chart, you can see that the more personally the country is, the lower level of media freedom the country will be. So that's the kind of conclusion I would like to say. Based on this study, the level of media freedom in a dictatorship has something to do with the power structure inside the regime. If it's less, you have less level of power sharing, then of course there will be less or lower level of media freedom. So that's the conclusion. So anything? What? Oh, it is. Yeah, hopefully not too shocked by the earthquakes this morning. All right, let's continue. All right, so it's So that's about media freedom, and the final part of this is the but that's not anyway. So the final part of this, I want to wrap up this topic and move on to the political economy section. So the final part of the dictatorship is that we, from the very beginning of this topic, our purpose is to compare different dictators in a very kind of static fashion, right? So we are not talking about the changes, even though I talk pretty frequently about the change in China, but basically either from that the media freedom part just talk about, or from the selectorate theory, it's a very static comparison. So they are not talking about evolutions of dictatorships, but as a matter of fact, not, I guess, no dictatorship will stay idle forever, right? Even though sometimes I mean, that's actually sometimes the intuition or the misperception people have about authoritarian regimes. Because in democracies, you have so many, well, because it's more open, and therefore you have lots of different things that can going on, that can happen, and therefore people think democracies can be very unstable. But as a matter of fact, dictatorships might also be very unstable. And depending on, for example, sometimes they will have coups, happening in the regime, or they could have social insurrections, protests, right? But the thing is, even though we don't have to go that far to talk about extreme events like revolutions or rebellions, well, dictatorships also, they will change themselves. So there will be also some kind of institutional change inside them. So, and therefore, one conceptual tool we can use, and also based on the insights from the selective theory, is that, well, when we look at, but this is actually the final important lessons to learn. So when we try to analyze dictatorships, we try to dissect a dictatorship into different parts. And how could you do that? And one thing that I found interesting is that we can actually, based on the composition of different actors inside a regime, and we can actually, create two different institutions inside a dictatorship. So first of all, let me show you this. This is actually not too complicated, because this is, as a matter of fact, another way to present the selective theory in a graphic way. So visually, you have dictator, right? And then, of course, as we have seen from the selective theory, so dictator has to share power with other people and then create a winning coalition. And this part, of course, this part represents the entire selectorate, right? So the people can choose leaders, and those who are, outside of the system, they are disenfranchised. There's no way to, to choose their leaders, and they're kind of powerless in that way. So inside the regime, dictators share power with other people, and they create a winning coalition. And then, of course, inside the selectorate, you have those who are not chosen, and therefore they are the losers here. And in a lot of dictatorships, there will be two kinds of institutions that are created. First of all, you have these power sharing institutions. Those institutions are created as a way to share power. So, for example, like People's Congress, Politburo, right? Because the people who are included in these institutions, they all have power, actually, just to different degrees. But there's some kind of power sharing there. And so these are what we call the power sharing institutions. But what is interesting is that you also have co-opting institutions. So these are institutions not for those very powerful elites, And as you can see here, oh, sorry. The power sharing institutions only exist between the dictator and the winning coalition. But what about those who are not inside the winning coalition? They are the losers, even though they do have some power, right? But they are not included in the winning coalition. So there's some kind of there are other kind of co-opting institutions here. I call that co-opting institution because for this kind of institutions, people do share power with each other. But for co-opting institutions, well, you might have some resources shared inside these institutions, but not necessarily power. So, and as a matter of fact, when we talk about China's People's Congress, it's sometimes a little misleading to mention that as an institute, as a power sharing institution, right? Because you wouldn't say those representatives are powerful, right? Those representatives, they have some resources, but it doesn't mean they can have a chunk of power from the Communist Party. But of course, inside the People's Congress, you still have a standing member. And most of those standing members, there's a standing committee, and inside the standing committee, the standing members, those people, of course, they are much more powerful than other non-standing members. So in that sense, if you want to talk about People's Congress, we have to distinguish between these two sets of people. But anyway, the important point is, in a dictatorship, they will also create such institutions to co-opt losers or even the disenfranchised. So they are included not to share power, but maybe share some resources. And so you have to be aware of this difference between resources and power. They're not the same thing in a dictatorship. So of course I can go on to talk about more details, but I guess for today I just want to introduce this concept to you, and especially to use these two concepts to create a map for the trajectory of institutional changes inside a dictatorship. So, okay, so conceptually, let me just tell you why I would think about creating this distinction between these two kinds of institutions. And the reason is a dictator, as a matter of fact, faces two different sets of risks, and they are all very different nature. So the first kind of risk is the risk coming from inside. So coups are, of course, the kind of rebellion initiated by people inside the regime, not outside the regime. If it's outside the regime, we will call that revolutions. And the theory presented here is this. So dictators, they will create power sharing institutions in order to avoid risks of coups from happening. And they will create co-opting institutions to co-opt social elites to prevent revolutions from happening. Let me give you an example, and probably you'll be less confused. Have you heard of any, I don't know, specific persons from China People's Congress? Do you know who are the members of China People's Congress? Have you heard of anyone? Any? So, okay, so let me change the question. Do you know Yao Ming, the NBA player, the Chinese NBA player who play Rocket, right? Houston Rocket. And do you know he is a member of People's Congress? And how about Stephen Chow, the movie actor? How about Gong Li? I suppose you all heard about their names, but what you might not know is they are all members of People's Congress, or another meeting. Because in China there's another co-opting institution, which is political consultative meetings. So there are two different kinds. There are two actually different kinds of people co-opting institutions in China. But think about this: why these institutions want these people? What has Yao Ming? What does Yao Ming have anything to do with People's Congress or political consultative meeting?
He may voice out for the athletes.
Yeah, right. So that's what they're trying to do, right? To include a lot of the important social voices, right? It's not because all these leaders like basketball or they like enjoy watching all these movies, right? Maybe, but that's not the main reason. They are included because they are influential in this society. People like them. And therefore, including these important people inside the system will help the regime boost and enhance legitimacy in this society. And if you have time to check the list, you'll see a lot of other people. Of course, sportsmen, movie stars, very successful business people, they're all included in these institutions. And of course, you wouldn't say Yao Ming is a powerful politician in China, right? That's not the case, right? He's simply included as a way, as I said, to boost the legitimacy of the regime and to prevent social revolutions from happening because they are very popular. And so the regime kind of piggyback on their popularity, to borrow their popularity to strengthen their own regime. So, I mean, in a sense, I think that's also why I think study dictatorships can be interesting because, well, it's actually quite complicated. But our mission is to make it simpler, right? So, according to our framework, there are two different kinds of institutions, and they serve different purposes. And therefore, of course, I'm not just here just trying to just sell this theory to you, but I want to say, with these two concepts, they can actually help us map out the trajectories of institutional change inside a dictatorship. So here is how I did it. So the interaction, as I said, can shape trajectories of institutional changes. So this is again a two-dimensional plot. And the x-axis represents the regime risk due to the lack of power sharing. So, or you can interpret that as a risk owing to the risk of coups. And for the y-axis, that represents the regime risk due to the lack of co-opting institution or co-optation institution. And you can also understand that the risks of revolution. So theoretically, we can actually draw this line or curve here to represent different types of authoritarian regimes. And of course, this curve can manipulate, or you can tweak this curve that for whatever you want. But the thing is, single party authoritarianism, they invest more resources in a power sharing institution, and therefore they have less risk for coup, but higher risk for social revolution. And next, you have bureaucratic military authoritarianism. So in other words, I mean, they line up all these different points. This is not, of course, a difference curve. That's not. There's a different combination representing these different dots or regimes up here represent different combinations of two risks. So some regime, they have a higher risks for coups, and some have higher risks for social revolution. And so single party authoritarianism, they are good at preventing coups from happening, but they might run a higher risk for social revolution. And bureaucratic, military authoritarianism, they spend less resources on power sharing, but a little bit more on cooptation. So the risk in combined is kind of in between. And then as you move along the curve from up to down, so you can see there's an increase in the level of investment in the social cooptation. And therefore, for personalist authoritarianism, it doesn't spend too much on power sharing at all because in this kind of regime, the leader inside the regime doesn't share power with other people almost at all. So it has more resources devoted for preventing social revolutions from happening, but it might actually run a higher risk of coups. So well, of course, I'm not sure if you are with me or necessarily by all the theories here, but if you do, then this is actually how we can understand the changes in China recently. So China, as we have mentioned for several times, it used to be a single party authoritarianism or dictatorship. But gradually, Xi Jinping factor brings the regime or changes the regime from that point along the curve to the personalist point. And therefore, it helps us actually to predict what might happen, even though prediction is extremely hard. But it might tell us what might happen. So Xi Jinping, through his first 10 years or until now, as I said, has purged all the people outside the party and continues to do so. And therefore, what eventually they have right now is actually pretty personalist regime. So everything almost, and also going back to the Geddes definition of personalism, right? So it means that a lot of discretion, Xi Jinping personally now has a lot of discretion about what should be done, either policies or personnel appointments. That's not the case, as I said, 10 or 20 years ago. But anyway, that's what they have right now. So in other words, Xi Jinping actually now the regime runs a higher risk of coups, but a lower risk of social revolution. So that's the kind of prediction this kind of a theory can have. And of course, this is not the end of the story because, well, Xi Jinping is still in power now, so we don't know, and everyone actually predicts him to be in power for another at least 10 years, as long as he's healthy. And therefore, there could be a lot of things happening down the road. But anyway, so I want to use this to wrap up our week on dictatorship. So in other words, we have a kind of more static framework for comparing levels of public goods provision across different dictatorships. We also have a theory about media freedom, and then to show you the evidence for that. And then finally, we ended this topic with a more dynamic understanding of the dictatorship. So before we move on, so any questions regarding this topic? Good, that's a good question. So for now, they are not complements, they are substitutes, right? So you're right. So in other words, the assumption based from this is that the dictator only has a limited amount of resources to do, right? So it's a very typical economics question, right? It's like he's a consumer or he's a dictator, and so he has this much, he has a budget constraint or she has a budget constraint. And therefore, the dictator has to decide how much resource I want to devote to preventing coups from happening and how much I want to devote to social cooptation. So you're right. This theory assumes that there's a trade-off between these two kinds of usage. And therefore, you have this. But the thing is, well, it kind of goes beyond this. I can, of course, share with you another paper I wrote before. So there are conditions under which sometimes these two things can be substitutes. And there are conditions under which these two things could be complements. So it depends on other things, not what we present here, but that's actually a pretty smart question. Right, so this is assumption. And but you can think about that. So when can it be complements instead of substitutes? So because the key assumption here is that if you have a very limited resources and you spend some money on the elites, you don't have, well, I mean, so it's kind of zero sum, right? You spend some money on elites, and so you cannot spend that money on ordinary people. So let's just, you have this trade-off to face for any dictators.
So as this graph shows, as the dictator become more personalistic, he face less stress, face less threat from the society, from revolution.
Right.
And so how is this to do with media freedom? Could you elaborate?
Well, no, but this is actually about quite different perspective. So for media freedom, it's, as I mentioned, the media freedom part is just about the power dynamics inside the regime. So a more personalistic, okay, so I guess a more straightforward answer to your question is that there are two different things, right? And two different things can happen at the same time. So for example, the argument from the previous theory is that because this regime has become more personalist, so there's less level of power sharing inside the regime, and therefore elites, they don't have to share information with each other. They don't need that trust either. And therefore media freedom level will go down.
Oh.
Right? So that's because of this, right? But this is for a very different thing, right? So this is about institutional evolution. And you also have to, well, this is complicated, I have to say. Why? Because when we talk about media freedom, it's some kind of policy, right? But this is not. This is institutions. So in other words, this is about institutional structure, right? So you can change policy easily. So that's why when I show you that Freedom House score between Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, you can see the very drastic change between the two eras. And that's because this is just a policy. You can change policy easily. But changing institutions is a very different thing. So this is not about policy. This is about institutional change. So that's the difference. And also the theory for, so these two things, like I said, can happen at the same time. So in other words, in a personalist regime, they can devote less resources to power share institutions and more to social cooperation. And they can also have low level media freedom. So these two things can happen at the same time. But I guess, but you might be right. I mean, they happen for different reasons. Right. So other questions? All right, so for now, let's just take a break until 20 and then come back for a second hour. Sorry. Let's come back. Because we might not have time for the review if we cannot finish the whole thing this hour, which is very unlikely. Okay, so now we are moving to an entirely different part. So the political economy parts will spend about 4 weeks on this, and it's a growing. I have to say it's a growing field, and so I want to give you some motivations for this. Why we have political economy as a field inside political science, and obviously, this is of course the intersection between political science and economics. And but to give you a kind of realistic picture of the field, I want to use this. This is actually a very helpful data from an economist, Angrist. They published a paper showing the social trends in social sciences over time. And so what they do is they collect data on the citations of academic papers. And of course, when we write papers, we'll cite our peers' papers as well, right? But we don't just cite other political scientists' papers. We also cite papers from economics, sociology, or other social sciences, right? Or even sometimes humanities, even though it's much more rare. But the thing is, what's the pattern? What's the pattern across different social sciences? And so this is, I think, again, I show this picture, I show all these different charts every year because this is a very good way to talk, to tell you about the trend in current social sciences. So, so we can see that we have political science on top there, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and economics. The thing is, here in Taiwan, I don't know why, but this is actually, since anthropology is also a kind of social science, but it's I don't know, in the NTU, that's not part of the college. And psychology, supposedly, is also part of the social sciences, but it actually belongs to the College of Science. I don't know why, but anyway, that doesn't matter. So the point is, you can see easily the trend, right? For political science, the black line represents economics. So you can see the trend, right? So, well, in 1970s, the most cited papers were from what? from sociology. So obviously we work more closely with sociologists than before. But over time, you can see that drop, right? And then the frequency for citing economics papers skyrocketed ever since 1980s. So that's roughly the time. And you can see this. This is a point. This is a critical juncture in history. After this point, you can see that so in other words, we don't cite sociologist papers that much now, and we work with economists more. And for psychology, even though I have to say, the data, I think the data could be a little bit outdated, but I don't know if they have updated data on this, because this is only until 2010. But I have to say, at least for the previous decade, political psychology, well, I personally also do some research in that field, political psychology also has become more and more important for political sciences. So I suppose psychology, the citation should pick up, right now. But it's not the most ones. But of course, we don't, anthropologies are still like always. I have to say, anthropologies, though there's no offense, but it's much more isolated in terms of working with other people. So that's why it's, I don't know, this is how the data shows. So for psychology, it's, we don't read their stuff much. But for sociology, also, I don't know, but they also don't cite anthropology anyway. But they cite economics a lot. And also the level of citation is similar between for political science and psychology. But they also, well, I have to say, the data can be a little bit conceding, right? And the reason is you can see that sociologists cite economics papers a lot. But why do they cite these papers? Not because they like them. It's to the opposite. That's because they don't like them. I'm not exactly sure what's the case here necessarily, because I do have lots of friends in these different departments. But in the US, I think it's pretty tense. They are almost in disagreement on every issue. So what I have to tell you is that even though they cite economics papers a lot, that's because they want to criticize them. So it's a little bit different from us. But anyway, that's something we figure out. And for anthropology, I think the thing is in general, they don't cite other people's data. It's, again, okay, but, we'll get used to that. So for anthropology, obviously, they cite sociology quite a bit, and then some psychology, and they don't like us, and they don't like economics, and they don't like political science. So anthropology, in a sense, I have to say, even though of course these are the relative positions, right? But you also have to see anthropology, in a sense, is more on its own. I don't know why, but somehow it's I guess maybe they don't necessarily like the idea of social sciences that much. And I respect that. It's not like I don't read anthropology. It's just like their departure, their assumptions are so different from us. So it's hard to sometimes it's hard to work together. But anyway, I do have friends there. To know. And for psychology, obviously they work closely with sociology, and that's why there's a social psychology. That's actually a course in a sociology department. But recently, they also cite economics a lot. But another giant actually in this field, Daniel Kahneman, just died several days ago, and he was the man actually who sort of introduced psychology to economics and entirely revolutionized the field. So that's why you have behavioral economics right now. And behavioral economics is very different from traditional economics, and due to their papers. So for psychology, they obviously work closely with sociology and gradually with economics, but less with us, with anthropology and with political science. Okay, but how about economics? For economics itself, you can see that who do they cite the most? political science. So that's also kind of starting from 1980s. So this tells us the birth of the field. It's not like political economy as a term was just coined in 1980s. That's not. Of course, well, if you remember David Hume or Adam Smith, they all use this term, political economy, right? I forgot which one. I think it's probably David Hume. So this term, was there for hundreds of years. But what I'm saying here is modern political economy was born in 1980s, roughly. That's when both political scientists and economists found that it's really critical for two fields to work together because there are a lot of things takes the cooperation between the two fields to explain, right? Like government policies, monetary policy, exchange rate policy. These are all economic affairs, right? But at the same time, these policies are made by politicians and government officials. And therefore, without understanding the incentive structures inside the government, there's no way for us to understand why these policies are made this way. So that I think that kind of paved the road for the growing tendency and the trends for political economy. So I think you can easily see this. And so, but of course, for economics, they cited us the most, and then also they cited psychology. As I said, psychology has become a very influential field for economics, and then sociology as well, and then anthropology, almost zero. So, right. So, of course, this is a very interesting paper, I have to say, in terms of giving us the data on this. But the reason why I showed you here is really about telling you this is the birth of modern political economy. And that's why nowadays I have to say, well, maybe that's not reflected in every course you're taking or you have taken. But I have to say, gradually this convergence between political science and economics is very obvious, at least in internationally, I have to say. All right, so this is just a little background. So, but what is political economy again? Again, I want to, on top of just sharing with you the data, I also want to share with you to motivate the reason for why we should do this. We can actually start from the interview Helpman did quite a few years ago. Do you recognize him? This is one of the giants in international economics. So there are, in international economics, if you want to take this course afterwards, there are three men, Helpman, Krugman. Do you know Krugman? Paul Krugman at Princeton. So previously also won the Nobel Prize. So he hasn't won this yet, but I don't know if he will. But so the Krugman, Grossman, and Helpman. These three Jewish scholars, they are the giants in international economics. And I actually took his course before. He's a snoozer actually. So it's easy to fall asleep, during his class because his accent is kind of very flat. So there's even no fluctuations anyway. But he's a giant in the field, I have to say. So why I show this to you is that this interview he did quite a few years ago when he was still in Israel. He used to teach at the, I think, University of Hebrew or Jerusalem, I forget. And then moved to Harvard. So before he went to Harvard, I think, when he was in Israel, he used to appear before a committee in the Israeli Congress. And then this interview actually was, according to him, the reason why he wanted to do political economy. And the reason, we can actually read it here a little bit. So he said one day he was asked to appear before this committee. They held a hearing prior to the renewal of the excise duty. That's about it. It's just like tariff. And he prepared a lot of materials about the structure of protection in Israel and its effects on the economy and how many damages it was causing and why this particular form of protection was bad and the like. And so he said his presentation was uneventful. The members of the committee listened to his presentation and asked only a few questions, and then he left. Outside in the men's room, he met a member of the committee who left the room with him, and they started talking. And oh, by the way, this Trafler is Daniel Trafler is also a very famous international economist at U of Toronto. So he said, well, this is backroom politics, right? But it's actually not quite the case. And so Hellman said, this guy said to me, your lecture was very fascinating, and I think we learned a lot. But I should tell you that you wasted your time because the decision to renew the excise duty had already been made. We all hear stories about political deals. Nevertheless, I was very upset. He was very upset hearing that my testimony was just a formality, not a real input into the decision-making process. For a number of years, he refused to testify to that. So this is, as I said, a lot of economic policies, they're critical to the economy of a country. Nonetheless, most of these economic policies are made inside the government or different branches of the government. And all these government officials or politicians, they are not pure economic agents. They are political agents, having a very different set of incentive structures. And therefore, if you don't understand politics, there's no way for us to understand economy at all. So after this kind of interview, Helpman, he continued to write a lot of papers with his friend, Gene Grossman at Princeton, about political economy. And that was, even though I have to say, his stuff was, of course, a little bit outdated from today's perspective, but he was, I think, nonetheless, the father, obviously the father figure in the field. So that's why we want to do political economy. It's because it's so important to converge or to combine the perspectives from both fields. Okay, but how do we do that exactly? And of course, this is like when we mention the creation of rents, it's also quite similar because these creation of rents are, they're created because of certain economic policies, right? But the reason why they're created, obviously, is not for economics. It's for political science. It's because of some political reasons. And therefore, to put it in context, what is political economy more precisely? So first of all, for this field, we investigate a lot of political factors behind economic activities. So it could be, for example, national borders and trade. And this is exactly what Helpman's interview was about, right? It's about imposing a kind of protection for Israeli products. But for Helpman, it doesn't make any economic sense. It only makes sense for those politicians, right? And the second example is special interests, right? There are lots of special interests in a society. They lobby the government. They make donations to politicians. So politicians will exchange favor with them by adopting certain kind of policies in their favor. That's what special interest groups are about. So these are more substantively why we do political economy is because we need the field to understand the actual process or decision making in real life. And second, there is a more technical reason for that. And this is in political economy, we also apply economic models to politics. And we have seen that actually from the very beginning, even though to a lesser extent. I mean, selection theory, the veto player theory, they're a little bit political economy, right? Because they do use some kind of economic models and use those models to understand political process. So one example, as I said, spatial model, right? We present people's preferences on a map in a space, and then try to analyze their relationship and how their relationship affects the possibility of making changes. And second example is like almost every rational choice. We will study a little bit of that in a minute. So we view political actors also as a rational actor. They make rational choices. So you probably remember that if you took my class that semester, right? So there are two key assumptions about that. So when we define people's preference relationships. And of course, another thing is that in the political economy, economics normally provides us with some kind of normative foundations, right? Well, I suppose you're taking some kind of economics courses now. And you probably know something already about economic efficiencies, right? So in economics, there seems to be a normative reason for why certain things should be done. It's because it achieves economic efficiency compared to other choices. So there's a yardstick right there. We judge different policies based on that yardstick. But how about politics? Have you ever seen that kind of thing? Like there's kind of political efficient? No, we don't do that. So in other words, there's an interesting division of labor between economics and political science in political economy. So economics tells us what is efficient to do, what kind of policies can achieve economic efficiencies, right? So in case of trade, almost across the board, economists don't like protectionism. So we shouldn't, adopt. The government shouldn't adopt tariffs. You should just allow for free trade to a great extent, right? That's very welfare enhancing for all the countries and of course for consumers. And then politics, when politics comes in, it always comes in as a distortionary force. It's because in politics, all the politicians have to get reelected and they need campaign contributions. So in order to get reelected, they have to take donations. And who would donate money to you? Special interest groups. And when special interests come in, what they want to do? They want policy favors instead. So what kind of policy favors? For example, in the case of trade, it's trade protection, right? If you have any local producers who are going to face very tough competition from foreign goods, and if the government can impose tariffs on these goods, these local producers will be saved, right? Because once you allow these foreign goods to come in, they might be driven out of business entirely, right? So for nationalism or for nationalist people, this is what? This is very bad. So for example, like TSMC right now is very successful, and the US couldn't produce a single chip. I mean, not the legacy chips, I mean the advanced chips. And if you are very nationalistic American, what would you say? Like Trump. What did Trump say? So Taiwanese take advantage on us, right? So we should take the this chip manufacturing industry back to the United States. Well, I mean, maybe I don't know if Trump is just nationalistic or not, but the thing is, this argument in itself sounds very nationalistic or patriotic. And this is also against economic efficiencies. Even though I'm not an expert on semiconductor industry, but if TSMC or Taiwanese producers, they do find a very efficient way of creating all these products, from a pure economic perspective, those factories, those fabs should stay here in Taiwan. And if you want to move it to other countries, the question is, for example, what the US is doing now is to give subsidies. And again, you should go back to your economic class and ask your professors, what about subsidies? They will tell you subsidies are also against efficiency. It creates inefficiency, actually. So anyway, so this is just an example. There are lots of examples in the world. Politicians, because of their interest in getting reelected or getting elected, they would say all things to please other people who have no idea or knowledge about the economics at all. But that's politics. And therefore, in the political economy, you have tons of examples where economics models can help us understand how to create efficient policies, while politicians will always try to distort these efficiencies and make policies in their own favor. So those policies serve their interests, but do not serve the interests of the entire society. So that's, again, so that you'll see that actually. in a bit. So these are, well, in a very broad sense, what political economy is about. And so I'm going to spend a few weeks on this to help you understand as an introduction. All right. So today we're going to go through kind of very basic concepts of Pareto optimality. But the thing is, I mean, the usefulness of this is not just about the concepts themselves, but also how it helps us understand the social dilemma, which is also a very typical dilemma we face in political economy. So I suppose if you have taken other econ classes already, you might have known this. So first of all, of course, we have to introduce each one has his or her own preference, and they can be represented by a utility function. UI represents person I's preferences if the following two conditions are met. So first of all, if a person I strictly prefers a policy X to another policy Y, so, well, this symbol here represents the preference relationship, but it's different from this, right? You can look, the shape, this is a little bit curved, right? So this is a little bit different. So this means X is preferred to Y. But here, it simply says there's a correspondence between your preference and the utility. This is not that straightforward, I have to tell you. Because, well, of course, this is a very economics, right? So define preferences in terms of utility. But in other disciplines, they might not look at this way. But anyway, let's move on. So in this, if you say someone prefers policy X to policy Y, it means that the utility X gives this person is greater than the utility Y gives to this person. So that's what this inequality is about, okay? And second, it's just, if a person is indifferent between X and Y and using this symbol, then this means that the utility X and Y gives to this person is identical. Okay, so this is just the first kind of how we specify utility functions. And then we have three concepts to talk about. First one is Pareto dominance. So a policy X, Pareto dominates another policy Y if two conditions are met. Pay attention to these two conditions because these are two important conditions for us to move on. So first of all, no one strictly prefers Y to X. That is, for all people, UI of X is greater or equal to UI of Y. So remember, this is not just the inequality, but also the equality sign here. So it's greater or equal to. Means that no one, so this is negative, right? No one strictly prefers Y to X. All right, so it could be because they are indifferent to both, right? It doesn't always the case that U of X is bigger than U of Y. It could be equal. Second, at least one person strictly prefers X to Y. That is, at least one I, U of X is bigger than U of Y. So in other words, you could have a scenario where suppose society has 10 people and 9 of them are indifferent between X and Y. Only one of them prefers, strictly prefer X to Y. So this is what we say Pareto domination. If X Pareto dominates another policy Y, it has to meet with these two conditions. All right. And if one policy Pareto dominates another, everyone should be able to agree that policy is better. Okay, or at least not worse. This is Pareto dominance. But then there's another related concept called Pareto improvement. This means that the move from a policy Y to an alternative policy X is a Pareto improvement if X Pareto dominates Y. This might look extremely straightforward, but it's actually not. You will see that very quickly. So, well, from a reasonable welfarist perspective, the policy change that is a Pareto improvement is unambiguously good. Okay. And third, we have another concept, related concept called Pareto efficiency. A policy is Pareto efficient if no other policy Pareto dominates it. A policy X is Pareto inefficient if at least one other policy Pareto dominates it. All right, so these are three related concepts: Pareto domination, Pareto improvement, and Pareto efficiency. And now let's get to the real examples. So this is the first example. So we have three policies, X, Y, and Z. And then also we have three people here, 1, 2, 3, person 1, person 2, person 3. And each policy gives that each of the different levels of utility, right? So, okay, so how can we, so the question is this: what are the Pareto efficient policies? Is there a Pareto improvement from X, Y, or Z? So let me do this first, and then we have a few exercises to follow. So for example, if you want to talk about like the general social welfare, we can just add all these numbers up, right? So what about X? Well, 5, 1, 4, that means 10, right? So X as a policy brings 10 utilities to the society. And Y, how about Y? 2, 3, 1, so it's only what? Only 6, right? It's smaller than X. And how about Z? Z has like 12. So in other words, I mean, this is a no-brainer, right? If you take a look at this, you say, okay, so now we should have Z, right? Because Z in total brings us 12 units of utility. Well, but the problem here is, again, we have to ask first, so what's the status quo? Because we don't live in a vacuum, right? So we have to, so what if, so, okay, so now if the status quo is X, so it seems that it's better to move from X to Z, right? Can we do that? Why? Or maybe the question is, can we make a Pareto improvement by doing that?
Not, because the first person that may go against this change.
That's right. So in other words, you're not going to make any Pareto improvement by moving X to Z, because you have two people who are going to suffer, to lose something. But how about Y to Z? Can we change from Y to Z? Right, yes, right, because for the third person, he or she is indifferent, right? And for person 1 and person 2, they are all benefited from the change. So in other words, we can make a Pareto improvement by moving Y to Z. This is clear. But what about the first question? What are the Pareto efficient policies? Sometimes it's more than one. So what are the Pareto efficient policies here in this case?
We find the status quo.
No, you don't. To do this, to make sure if there are any Pareto improvements to be made, you might have to do that. But to find the Pareto efficient policies, you don't. Because you just make this judgment on individual policies, right? So in other words, to put it more simply, we just need to decide whether X, Y, or Z are Pareto efficient policies. And remember the definition of this. What is a Pareto efficient policy? It is a policy when it is a Pareto efficient policy when you cannot make any Pareto improvement. So what are the policies like this? What are the policies here that can fit this description?
X and Z.
What? X and Z, right? That's true. I mean, it's a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that, well, X in itself doesn't seem to be a very good policy. But it's Pareto efficient because there's no way to make any Pareto improvement from X to the other policy. So it is a Pareto efficient policy. And Z as well, because it's also, there's no way for Z, there's no way for you to make change Z from change Z to Y. And of course, also not to X, right? So in this situation, we have two Pareto efficient policies, X and Z. All right. Okay. So, but of course, I mean, let's do a little more exercises and see. The importance is, of course, just help you to familiarize with all these concepts, and then we can move on to the second thing. How about this one? This is a new setup. So with the same questions. So which one, can we make any further improvement here? From which to which? Anything else? From what? From Z to Y, right? So we can make two Pareto improvements here, either move X to Y or Z to Y. That's right. And in other words, what are the Pareto efficient policies in this case? Only one, right? Just Y, right? Because you cannot make any further Pareto improvement from Y to anything else. All right. And how about this? The third example. Can we make any Pareto improvement? Any? None, right? So we cannot make any Pareto improvements here. So it's like, so I mean, the thing is, I'm not sure if you have kind of foreseen what I'm going to do in the next slides, in the next few slides. So in other words, in this kind of society, whether the status quo is X or Y or Z, this society kind of gets stuck. That's the thing, right? So that's always the case. I mean, I suppose if you pay attention to any policies, sometimes we found this policy extremely lousy and bad, and thinking about alternatives. But you simply cannot do that socially. And that's also why, or I should say, that also explains sometimes the attractiveness of dictatorships, right? Because the reason why we cannot make any Pareto improvements is because we define the question this way. We define a Pareto improvement as meeting two conditions, right? You cannot hurt any one of them, right? So at least one of them, strictly prefer, X to Y, but the other people, they have to be at least indifferent between the two. If any one of them doesn't like it, then that's not a Pareto improvement. So in other words, a lot of social dilemma happens when we cannot get out of this, we cannot, offer a Pareto improvement. But so what if there, here comes the dictator and say, why should we care about this person, right? We just move. So that's why dictators or dictatorship as an institutional design is attractive to a lot of people, because now you can easily move one policy to the other if this original policy is bad. Well, sorry, I had to make it. Okay, so in this case, this third example, all of them are Pareto efficient policies, and we cannot make any Pareto improvements. And next, this should look familiar. Can we? For this one? Well, basically still, right? From X to Y. If X is the status quo, moving from X to Y is a Pareto improvement. But previously we have another example where we only have, we put 4 in this, and therefore you can actually make Z to Y as well. But now you can't, because person 1 will lose one unit of utility. Okay, so in other words, in this case, Y and Z are both Pareto efficient policies because you cannot make any Pareto improvements for them. All right, so I suppose through these 4 exercises we have, you have, I suppose, familiarized yourself with all these concepts. And then let's move on to the social dilemma, because, well, these concepts are useful for laying out the social dilemma we have. But I guess the most important job for us as political economists is to figure out a way to get out of the social dilemma, right? So let's do this. So using one example again, So Y is not Pareto efficient, right? Because it can be moved. And X and Z are Pareto efficient. So this is quite similar to one of the examples previously. So, but the thing is, moving from Y to X obviously is not Pareto improvement, even though Y gives the society 6 units of utility, and X obviously gives 10. So X is a better choice, but we cannot do this because X in itself is a Pareto efficient policy. You cannot make any further Pareto improvements from X. So the problem here is, as I just stated, this is what the social dilemma every country is facing. Moving from Pareto inefficient to efficient policy needs not to create Pareto improvement. So sometimes people get confused, right? So thinking about like, well, making Pareto improvement means that you can move from a Pareto inefficient policy to efficient policy. But that's not necessarily the case, given the definition for Pareto improvement, right? So you have to, well, again, as I said, so the problem here is, especially in democracies, since in democracies with kind of human respect for human rights, it's really difficult for us to do any policy that can, by design, hurt people's interest in a society, right? Any particular group's interest. So that's actually kind of against the principles of democratic system. So what can we do? So how to overcome social dilemma? So this is, as I said, even though probably a very good way to start political economy as a field, because this is actually a very central question people are asking. So create efficiency, so use actions to maximize total utility. And second, social dilemma sometimes is more about distribution of benefits, right? So if we can do transfers to compensate losers, maybe we can overcome social dilemma by doing that. So this is actually an example from the US. So in 1962, American Congress created Trade Adjustment Assistance, TAA, and the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 to help workers and firms adjust to dislocation that may be caused by increased trade coordination. And so it is justified, now it was then on grounds that government has an obligation to help the losers of policy-driven trade opening. So, well, of course, I mean, this is not a course about international trade, but trade happens to be a very typical example of this. Well, in general, well, trade is very welfare enhancing. When you open up your national borders to foreign goods, it's always very welfare enhancing for especially consumers. Nonetheless, it also creates losers. Sometimes they are local producers. And as I said, if you produce things that are not internationally competitive, and if the country allows foreign goods to come in, I mean, consumers are not idiots, right? They would choose the best products for themselves. And there's no way for them to stick to that unless for that nationalistic reason, right? I want to buy our national product because I'm a proud whatever. So that's not the case mostly. So people would just, make very efficient decisions for themselves, right? So what the government can do, well, of course, the reason why for the US to do this previously was also, of course, because if you don't do this, these losers, they are going to take political actions, either through lobbying the government or, take to the streets and, initiate lots of protests to block these free trade agreements. So, to compensate, if, the thing is, so this is a typical social dilemma, right? As we just said, comparing 3 different sets of policies, X, Y, and Z. So some policies obviously gives the society a higher level of welfare, but they might hurt individuals. So what we can do is, what if the government create things to compensate those losers and let them support the policy as well? Then we can overcome the social dilemma. So this is what this policy is about. But I have to say, through the analysis we're going to do, you will see that the policy might sound pretty ideal, but it might also fail if certain conditions are not met. Okay, so let's now introduce this very simple political economy model. Suppose the policy has two components, an action. For example, a trade policy, right, opens up the border, lower the tariffs and other non-tariff barriers. And also a transfer scheme. It could be something like what I just showed you in the last slide, right? A transfer help those workers and firms to adjust to this, trade opening. So it could be redistribution. So we have two things. So suppose this society has N people, and A is a set of possible actions, different policies, of course, different trade policies. And T represents the transfer. It's also a vector, right? So there's a couple of different kinds of transfer schemes we can think of. T equals T1, T2, all the way to Tn. For different, okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, this represents individuals in a society because there are N people here. So in other words, we make transfers to losers, right? We're not going to make transfers to everyone because some of them are winners. They don't have to be compensated. We only compensate losers. So that's why you have T equals T1 all the way to Tn. Because supposedly, even though they might not necessarily differ across individuals, but they should have differences across some of them. Individual transfers can be either positive or negative, right? Because this is a kind of redistribution, and therefore, suppose you are the winner, and the money has to be from your pocket. So the transfer for you will be negative, and I transfer the money to another loser. So for this loser, the transfer will be positive, but for the winner, the transfer is negative. That's why individual transfers can take either positive or negative values. And another condition or assumption here is that the transfer schemes must have balanced budgets. So in other words, all the transfers, they are taken out of the pockets of the winners and then reallocate these transfers to those pockets of losers. So this is kind of fair deal between these two groups of people. So formally, a policy is a pair A and T. Okay, so let's move on. For individual preferences, because we want to apply those concepts, right? So we have to talk about individual preferences over action transfer pairs. A person I's preferences over policies AT are given by that person's utility function, UI of AT, which is pretty straightforward already. If person I prefers AT to A prime T prime, then U of AT is bigger than UI of A prime T prime. So this is again just how we specify utility function and connect that with people's preferences. And next, a person I is indifferent between AT and A prime T prime if the utilities are identical. So these are just set up. But next step is critical. Now we have to specify our utility function and we apply quasi-linear preferences. So this is a very important assumption because without this, sometimes I guess those transfer schemes might not work in saving the policy. So now suppose you can separate person I's utility from a policy AT into two components. We'll pay attention to this. First one, these people, they derive utility from, first of all, payoff from action A, and this is VI of A. In other words, the function VI of A. And payoff from transfer TI is simply TI. That's why it's quasi-linear, right? It's not, let me finish this. So this equation is this. This equation, UI of AT, is specified as VI of A plus TI. This is a quasi-linear. Because the second component is linear to, T is linear to UI, but A is not, right? Because you have something there, V of I. We don't know what's the functional form it's going to take. And we don't need that information to do the analysis. So two important assumptions here. payoffs from money are linear. So money equals utility. Money means this TI. This is a transfer. Mostly a lump sum transfer. I give you like, $200, $300. That's the transfer, right? So you directly derive utility from this. It's linear. But, now we do this by additively separate them. So this is called additive separability of transfers and policy. It means that they are combined in a linear fashion. Because what can we do this in a different way? If you specify this function differently, in other words, I can actually multiply Ti with V of A. In that sense, they are not separable. There are interactions between them. But for now, they're linear because they're additively separable. But this is a little bit tricky, a little bit of the technical detail that you don't actually have to pay too much attention. Just we impose this assumption about quasi-linear, but the problem here, as we are going to explain in a minute, once this assumption is violated, this idea might fail. So that's okay. So let's again take a break and come back. I have to finish this, and then we probably can talk about the midterm exam. All right, so we were here at the definition of the quasi-linear preference. All right, and so any questions about this? Well, it's called quasi-linear because you have Ti here, which is linear to U, but Vi is not necessarily linear. So we don't know about what's inside V of A, but we just know there is a function there to explain the policy effects on these persons' utility. So let's do another exercise on this one because this is critical. And to show you why quasi-linear preference as an assumption is important. Under QL, a quasi-linear, if we apply this utilitarianism idea, which is to add up the utilities for all the people in the society, it cares only about the sum of the VIs, and they don't care about transfers. And this is actually quite important for this policy to work, compensation policy to work. So let's do this first. Under utilitarianism, one would prefer xt to yt prime if and only if the following condition is met. So in other words, so we suppose we have two different people. So u1 of xt plus u2 of xt. So this is the sum of the utilities for both person 1 and person 2 given policy x and transfer t. All right. It has to be bigger than the sum of the other condition, ui yt prime plus u2 of yt prime. So this is the sum of the two utilities from policy y, and t prime is another kind of transfer. So x and y are again different policies, right? The set of is belonging to the set of A. And then since we already know how we specified ui, so we can replace this with the following expressions. So it's going to be v1x plus t1 plus v2x plus t2. And then the sum of all these terms has to be bigger than v1y plus t prime 1 plus v2y and t prime 2. So remember that they are all indexed now, right, with subscripts 1 and 2 because they belong to particular individuals. And given our assumption of the balanced budgets here, implies T1 plus T2 equals T prime 1 plus T prime 2 equals 0. They have, because the budget has to be balanced. As we said, of course, now we only have an extremely simplified context. You have only two people here. So one has to be the winner, the other one has to be a loser, right? So of course, we don't care which one it is, because for now, what we care is just the addition of the two. So because of this condition, this inequality can be further simplified to this. V1 of x plus V2 of x has to be, the sum of them has to be bigger than the sum of V1y plus V2y. So what does that mean? With this quasi-linear preferences, it means that transfers don't matter for utilitarianism, only the action matters. Okay, so still, I suppose until this step is still quite abstract. But let's apply this to a actual example, a policy, trade policy again, of course. Now suppose we're talking about trade liberalization as a policy, right? And in a society, we have capital owner and labor owner. So these are two factors for production. And or you can understand this in terms of workers versus capitalists, right? A very classic class conflicts between the two. And we assume that workers, they enjoy trade protection more as opposed to capitalists. This is not always the case, all right? So bear in mind, even though I won't spend this point too much, but bear in mind, it's not always the case. In trade policy, in international trade, it depends on a lot of different factors. For example, the factory endowments of a country. That would decide whether you stand to lose or to win as a worker or as a capitalist. But here we make an assumption that so you can see how I draw this curve. So this is utility. And then for UL, this is the utility for labor owner. And their utility goes up when you have higher tariffs. But for capitalists, because they like trade openness, so if you have higher tariffs, their utility goes down. So this is, again, that's a very hypothetical situation in order to explain the theory. So don't get too serious about this. Could be very unrealistic, but that's fine. Okay, so now suppose the current status quo is AP. This is the tariff under the current situation, AP. So you can have this hollow circle represents the utility for the labor owner, the workers. And this is the square, solid square represents the utility level for the capitalists, all right? So far, so good. Next, now suppose we're trying to liberalize the trade policy regime in this country. And we lower the tariff from AP. A represents policy, as if you remember. AP, P represents protectionism. Move AP to AFT, so the policy for free trade, AFT. Okay, and what happens? What happens is that, of course, for the workers, they will lose, right? Because, as I said, they enjoy higher protection. So their utility will drop from this to this, right? And for capitalists, because they enjoy free trade, and therefore their utility go up to this, another solid square. Okay, so this is a new level of utility for each, all right? So, as we just explained, this is obviously a policy change, right? And then is it a policy, improvement? Is this a Pareto improvement? Probably not, right? Because workers lost because of the policy. So this is not a Pareto improvement. A lot of trade policy, a lot of policy, changes and trade liberalizations, they are not necessarily Pareto improvement. So based on our previous discussion, what a government can do is to offer compensations, right? Offer compensations to workers, so they might be willing to accept and support the trade policy change. All right. So what happens is this is how it happens, right? So and of course this is when we impose quasi-linear preferences. Because if you remember what the functional form for the utility function is Vi of A. So this is how we draw. just show that geometrically show how it looks like the function, the VI of A, right? And TI is simply the money. So what happens in geometry if you do this? You're going to have the shift in parallel, right? So your level of utility goes up, but doesn't affect the curvature of, or it doesn't affect the utility function through the channel of V of I, VI of A. So you see that? So of course, mathematically, it's just because this is a quasi-linear, this is a quasi-linear function. And therefore, when we add or, deduct plus or minus Ti, it means that the curvature is not, the curvature for VI of A is not going to be changed. So it's just going to be shifted either upwards or downward. And in this case, the capitalist is a winner, and therefore the transfer, of course, will be out of the pocket of them. So they take a loss. So their utility goes down to this level, but still it goes down in parallel. It shifted downwards in parallel. So it's a new level U prime C. And for workers, getting this level of transfer, the utility shifts upward. The utility curve is shifted upwards from UL to U prime L. Does this make sense so far? Then what happens? What happens, of course, before that, we also have, so the thing is, this is what I just explained in words. This is simply the shift. This is simply the shift. The UPL minus UFTL equals to this, because this is simply the shift in parallel. So you basically shift the whole curve upwards by t, right? And that's why these two things have to be equal, because the slope doesn't change at all, because both curves are in parallel. And the same thing goes for the capitalist utility curves, right? So when we overlay these two curves on each other, we can actually observe the changes between their old welfare or utility level and the new utility level. So what happens? So for the workers, this is their post policy. This is their original, before, I should say, pre-policy utility level is here, right? And this is originally, if the government didn't do anything, the workers are going to lose this much from this to this. It's very obvious, right? Now, because of the transfer, its utility level goes up to this hollow circle here. This is a new post-policy welfare level for the workers. For the capitalists, this is the original level of the utility. And this is the post-policy, the square, not the square, sorry, the triangle. This solid triangle here. This is the new welfare level. It's a lower, because originally, if you don't have the transfer, they don't have to pay the transfer. They can get this much, right? But now, because they pay the transfer, their utility level goes down to solid square. So I marked this in red. Now you can see that this is a post policy, and it's TL and TC should also be identical because the budget is balanced, right? So what's happening here? What's happening here is that if you compare this red solid circle to the original solid black circle, the utility level is actually higher because of the policy. And for this, for the capitalists, this red solid triangle is still higher than the original solid, solid square here, which means this is a win-win situation, right? Not the case before the policy the transfer was made. Before the transfer was made, it wasn't a win-win situation. Only the capitalists were going to win. But for the workers, they're going to lose. And now, because of the compensation or the transfer, the workers also become the winners. So both of them are going to support the policy. And what is more important, this is a what? This is a Pareto improvement, because both stand to win after the trade liberalization. Well, and this is just visual to help you understand. This is even though just let you know the difference, right? They're both positive. They have positive gains after the trade liberalization. All right. Okay, so this is what happens when we impose assumption of quasi-linear preferences. And well, actually, in the textbook I assigned, the book also talks about other situations where you might fail to make the policy change. And what are these potential scenarios? First of all, maybe you don't make enough transfers, right? If you don't make enough transfers, and in this case, the new welfare for the workers is still lower than the original welfare level, and therefore the workers, they are still the losers. So that's when insufficient transfers were made, right? But this is pretty straightforward, not interesting. What could be interesting is that what if you have a nonlinear, quasi-linear preferences? So visually, this is quite clear, right? So if you compare the welfare levels for the workers before and after the policy, now the new red solid circle is lower in utility than the original solid black circles, right? But why? Because now, at least geometrically, what you can see here is that the curvature has been different. The curvature now for the new utility is different now. So it's not quasi-linear. In other words, it's not a simple shift in parallel from UL to U prime L, or I use double prime to represent a different curve. So now you do the shift, but the curvature also is changed. So in other words, if this quasi-linear preference doesn't hold, then, well, you could have this case where, even you made compensations, but that's not going to, buy the support of the losers or the workers. But before that, let me move this for them. Well, this can also happen to the capital, right? Previously, the case was for labor, and this is for capital. This is when you have this transfer made, but the capitalist's utility function has been changed so much, and well, the new level of welfare, this red triangle here, is lower in utility than the original black square, solid square. So in other words, this violation of quasi-linear preferences can happen for both labor owners and capital owners. So, well, of course, I will also continue. I also have to explain why, right? But before that, I want to go back to the original results and ask you a question. Let's go back to this one. This is the final results, the ideal results, right? Let me ask you a question. According to our previous definitions of Pareto efficiency, domination, and improvements, do you think this is necessarily the final equilibrium? The location of this red solid circle here, is there another better efficient policy than this one? We made this much transfer, right, to make it happen. Is this the most optimal level of transfer? according to our previous definition of Pareto optimality. Could there be other alternatives that are more efficient in economic sense? Can you think of any? So previously, so anyone, if you can help me, what's the definition for, or the conditions to be met for Pareto domination? Or more precisely, there are two conditions, right? One of them has to be, one has to prefer strictly X over Y. But and the first condition is they have to be, all of them have to be either prefer or indifferent between X and Y, right? This means that, well, previously, I mean, in those exercises that we did, there are also cases where the change, they might benefit some people strictly, right? The level goes up from 2 to 3 or from 1 to 5. But there are also some people, they are willing to support, or you can make the Pareto improvements when they are indifferent between the two. So this exposition, this graphic display is actually not the optimal result. Why? You don't have to make this much for labor owners to accept. Now it's positive, right? You see this positive gain. You see this positive gain, this shaded area here. But if, as I said, you only have to do this, solve this social dilemma by making Pareto improvements, what you have to do is actually to make workers indifferent between the two. In other words, you actually only have to make this much until probably here, right? You don't have to offer this much transfer to make that, to make the improvement. But of course, I mean, it's not entirely the same as saying they would support. That could be another question. But at least from what we, based on all the concepts that we introduced today, this is not optimal. You don't have to make this much transfer at all to make this happen, to make a Pareto improvement happen here in this context. All right, so that's, okay, so but then let's go back to this more thorny issue about, well, of course, the thing is, graphically speaking, I mean, you understand why, if you have a violation of quasi-linear preference, why this case will fail, right? But could you think of any more specific or concrete examples of the violation of non-linear, quasi-linear preference? A more intuitive way of thinking about this is, of course, the people's utility might change according to different levels of tariffs. And one thing I can offer, I mean, this is your job, of course, but I would offer, for example, well, suppose, opening up to foreign goods might bring the two possibilities, right? One is, in a more realistic sense, some national security concerns. So if you bring in these other concerns into this, so because we don't know V of A, right? So V of A is just a function, right? We don't know what's inside. And, so in that sense, it's kind of open to debate in terms of this current framework can allow us to incorporate other factors as well. One is national security. If you lower the tariff too much, you think this influx of foreign goods might hurt the national security. So your utility function can change. Or because some kind of maybe environmental concerns, the bringing in foreign goods might, I don't know, somehow hurt local environments. That's also a possibility. So in other words, I suppose in terms of this formal structure, I mean, it's pretty much complete in terms of how we understand the non-linear non-quasi-linear preference can actually sabotage this policy endeavor to compensate the losers and save the policy. But you can think about this for yourself about what kind of actual real life examples that can help you visualize what kind of preferences are non-quasi-linear or non-linear. All right.
So it's like a more open-ended question.
Open-ended question. Well, I mean, so right, because there are a couple of ways why people's in utility functions will have a different shape, right? So I'll just try to give you two examples. One could be national security concerns. The other one could be environmental concerns. So there are lots of other ways you can think about this issue as well. But of course, for us, the job for this class is just to tell you the assumption about quasi-linearity of preferences would be critical to make this policy work. And we can always think about ways to address the issue in real lives. Okay, so this is about what I have to say about optimality for Pareto optimality for today. So you have enough for your exam. And we have about less than 25 minutes, but I want to do a review. But before that, I mean, do you have any questions regarding today's material? Because there's only 1 week away from the midterm.
So I can conclude that non-quasi-linear preferences result as like external factors that cannot be put it into like transfer calculation, so that you cannot transfer the environmental issue into something you can qualify into money, so that you can transfer.
Well, you can always make the transfers. The problem is just the transfer might not buy you support.
Oh.
Right? So because the problem is not, you don't have the transfer, right? So previously there was a simple case where if you don't make enough transfers, of course, this kind of policy endeavor will fail, right? But for a much thornier issue is it's not about the money you transfer, because you did transfer the money. But the problem is people's utility function has been changed. So it's not quite that linear because you're not shifting this curve in parallel. And the shape is very different. And therefore there could be, so that's why I gave you the examples of national security and environmental protection. It could be these other concerns that make your utility function look this way. And if this happens, making more transfers doesn't take you anywhere, because transfers only affect, so the thing is, mathematically, it's very easy to understand because the structure of the utility function is this. What do we say is that if you have this function, then you can just make transfers to make people accept the policy change, right? Through this channel. But what I'm talking about is that if it's not quasi-linear, which means your V of A could be, you are at the different levels of tariffs, you might have different levels of concern for this policy. So the policy, if that happens, or curvature becomes even steeper, if that happens, you might not be able to make a transfer. You might not be able to overcome this issue with more transfer. So that's the problem. You have to address those issues, directly instead of just making transfers. But the one thing I think a big takeaway is that this kind of analysis will help you to kind of isolate issues. So now we know what kind of issues we might face, and we can target at those issues. And of course, we also with this you also know sometimes why even if some countries or governments they do make transfers, but still they cannot make the change. So it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, again, that sunflower student movements, pop up in my mind very often. It's like, of course, I would blame the administration back then for failing to do enough compensation. Well, I guess that's fair. But I suppose that movement also kind of teaches us that trade policy change is not just about trade. And that's a very typical example of like people obviously mixed national security with economic concerns, and then you have a totally different way to a different calculus for the whole thing.
Like some other things you cannot buy with money.
Yeah, right. So that's another way to put it. Yeah, but anyway, so this is about this, and if there are no other questions, then we can move on to the exam. So basically, let's go back to the so for the midterm. Oh, by the way, I prepared, even though I'm not sure if that's going to be very helpful, but I think it's always, I offer some writing tips. I mean, I know they are very general. These are very general tips, but at least to help you avoid some easy mistakes, I suppose. Because people sometimes will, especially for those freshmen, right? So you don't quite know how to write essay questions. So I would suggest you maybe just take a look at writing tips. Well, again, these are very general principles. So, well, first of all, be sure to stay on topic and answer the question. So there's also, I think some people, they would just want to write a lot, right? They just fill in unrelated jargon or concept based on your memory of other things. So that's not going to work. And second, also pay close attention to read the questions carefully and be sure to, and also information provided in those questions, in the questions themselves, and also organize your answers well. So you have enough time, I suppose, 3 hours, and we only have 3 questions. I don't think you need that much time actually. But so don't you don't have to be in a rush. So just organize your answer or your answers nicely. So well, some students previously, I think they may just mechanically list key points, but overlook the connections between paragraphs and their answers. So I guess when this happens, if you answer these questions correctly, of course, you still get some point, but it's not going to guarantee a high score. So yeah, in general, I think essay questions are not about filling blanks or providing simple answers. So having well-structured and logically rigorous answers is crucial for earning a high score. So that's just a suggestion. And most essay questions will involve thinking and judgments rather than simply regurgitating memorized answers. So don't worry, just regurgitate. And it's important to clearly state your positions at the beginning of your answer or response, and then provide detailed explanations for why, or justify your answers. And you don't have to, put in a lot of things outside the classroom. So that's again, you don't have to include a significant amount of knowledge beyond what it was covered in class. And also the handwriting, that's just important. And well, it's always, I would allow you to write in Chinese. So you can write in Chinese or in English, depending on your tastes. And then, but just be sure to have a clean handwriting. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to grade. So these are, again, I have to say, I don't know how to put it. It's always a very difficult part of teaching, I suppose, in terms of teaching, in terms of writing. So, but I suppose the more practice you do, the much better you perform in the actual exam. So, but these are just tips I think might be helpful to you. And then for the mock exams, I have posted the solution guide for this, I think, most complicated question among the 4. And let me repeat again, 2 out of the 4 questions will be, 2 out of the 4 questions will be chosen to be included in the actual exam, and one of them will be new. And of course, I'm not 100% sure if this one will be included, but it's good to prepare, I suppose, a very good preparatory material. You can read through my solution guides and of course, the thing is, one thing that you might want to avoid from doing is that, I came across this kind of very strange way of So for example, some student would say, as we talk about in class, or some, come on, you have to write it down, right? You cannot simply say, as we talk about in class, and this and that. So I mean, that's like very stupid, I have to say. You cannot do that. So, you don't even have to mention that. Just state your reasoning, straightforward. And that's what you have to do. Okay. Yeah, right. But by the way, so I suppose some of you have read the guide. Do you have any questions regarding the guide? I think this is supposedly pretty detailed and clear enough. Any questions? No? All right. And how about other questions? In terms of the wording and in terms of, no? All right. So the new question, of course, will be pretty much very similar to all these questions in format. So I suppose if you have prepared for all the 4 questions well, then I don't think you have any questions. And of course, I have made appointments with individual students, and we can talk. I can talk and help you with your answers too. All right. So if any more questions regarding the midterm? Yeah.
Well, where will the office?
For today, it's my office. It's 7:45. It's 7th floor, 7:45. Room 745. All right, so otherwise we can go back to do a little bit of review and see if you have any questions. Well, I got, but we still have some time for that. So I guess for the first half of this class, it's mostly about comparative politics, and especially about institutional analyses. And very quickly, let me just repeat some of the major points. So traditionally, I suppose your previous impression about this is that, we make typologies, right? Most of them are descriptive, and it's not like they're not useful, right? It's being descriptive. So like these distinctions between these different systems, parliamentary, presidential, unicameral, bicameral, unitary, we didn't talk about this in the class too much, and majoritarian. So in other words, we went through the details of the definitions for these different typologies. And but traditionally they talk about, well, that's I guess that's because previously it was like people took a legal approach to this. They study constitutions and then try to understand, different clauses and what they imply. But there's a kind of more legal approach to this. But as a political scientist, then of course we do this in a different way. So veto player theory is one of the very powerful tools for analyzing the effects of these different institutional setups. So if you remember, well, of course, if it appears in the exam, I mean, I of course won't ask you to memorize the definition, but you have to understand the veto player is individual. It could be anyone. We can specify them as a president or as a legislative chamber, and their agreement is necessary for a change of the political status quo, right? And then the key parameters have, include the number of players, their ideological distance, and also the construction of win set. And then also, I think over time, the class, what we did was to kind of contextualize these concepts, these tools in actual institutions, right? So there are different institutional setups, and they allow us to specify different people's veto players. And also be sure to know the distinction between institutional veto players and partisan veto players. And we, of course, as introduction to poli-sci, we haven't had the time to get into other types, especially the partisan types. So in our class, mostly we're talking about institutional veto players. So for example, when we do that analysis on the distinction between parliamentary and presidential system, right, we have a sequential game with president and Congress, and they play different different roles in at different stages, and that's kind of their power. Their power is given by the institutions, so that's why they're institutional veto players. And also, this is that's why I said it's a spatial model. So we plot their preferences on a map and try to understand the possibility for moving status quo to a new policy. And this is especially interesting case where actually if C is a proposer of the change, and they have win sets of this size, and what if C wants to propose a policy change, of course C will exploit his or her agenda setting power by choosing CS, which is closest to his or her own ideal point. And because that point also falls inside the win set, and therefore it will also be accepted by B and A. So this is a very kind of classic application of veto player theory. And another thing is to do this kind of spatial modeling or political competition, we sometimes do this on a two-dimensional policy space. And then, of course, we try to we try to draw the win set. This is a set of policy alternatives that would defeat the status quo in a pairwise context under whatever voting rules have been employed. And also, in this context, we require unanimity. So everyone has to agree. So this is connected to what we just talked about previously in today, right? So to solve the social dilemma, well, we try to do this in a harder way, right? In a democracy, everyone has to be or every interest has to be respected. And therefore, we're trying to think about ways that could make everyone happy. So making compensation is a way to do that, right? You might be a loser from the policy perspective, but you could win if we make another compensation to you. So that's what democracy is about. But in a dictatorship, sometimes some people are totally ignored, and therefore, even though they are relevant, but they are not respected anyway. So this kind of competition, of course, we tend to impose this unanimity because we assume this model will be applied to democracies. And therefore, if you want to apply this model to a dictatorship, then probably we have to fix some of the assumptions. And then we have to draw in different circle for every veto player, and also any policy alternative in the win set will win the support of all veto players in pairwise vote against the status quo. So these are just basic points about spatial modeling. And also for consequences, policy stability, shifts in policy, or variation in the size of policy shifts, and also agenda setting power. So these are the features we can incorporate easily into a veto player theory framework. So let me okay, so very quickly, I think you probably have these are things that you can learn yourselves by reading the slides. But one thing that I guess we can repeat again for the remaining 5 minutes is that, so last week we went through some of these very basic concepts of selection theory. And today, as I explained at the very beginning, we expand this topic to include the formation of the kind of winning coalition, right? But for this one, the biggest contribution, of course, is the finding that the ratio of W over S can be a very good predictor of the public goods provision in all the countries, actually, especially in dictatorships. And I think you might want to be sure you understand the reasons behind this. And do you have any questions regarding the logic here? The W over S, the size of the win set, it has to be small for the loyalty. So for loyalty to be, so loyalty of the winning coalition members would be high when WS is small. And under two conditions, right? Either W is very small, so the winning coalition is very small, means that it's very competitive, and therefore the people who have been included inside the winning coalition would have to be more loyal to stay inside the coalition. Or if S is huge, right? If S is huge, it means that for the dictator, Decatur has a lot of candidates to choose from, and therefore, the people who have been inside the coalition have to be also very loyal to stay. So, and then of course the WOS would be so even though WS is the kind of variable we use for testing the hypothesis, but the idea behind W/S is actually loyalty, right? So it basically means that if winning coalition members have to be, don't have to be very loyal to don't have to be very loyal to the Decatur will have to provide more benefits to them to compensate, right? So that means you have to provide more public goods provision. But if if the Decatur don't have to do this to retain all the coalition members, then the provision of public goods would be low. So that's the logic. The logic actually rests on the level of loyalty. And then this is the prediction for the performance according to this WS ratio. So, well, I guess for the remaining 3 minutes, I want to open up so to see if you have any questions. I mean, it seems that you do have, right? Yeah. Which comes first? I mean, the question is. No, I think the problem is that supposedly, okay, so good. I guess the question here is when the regime is established and you have a particular setup or bands of power between Decatur and other allies or political elites. So that's why I said this is actually a very static theory. It applies to a particular time point in time. And the reason is it depends the size of W and S here. The sizes of them are totally exogenous. It's not so okay. So this is a jargon, of course. So the thing is, the sizes they affect the level of public goods provision, right? If you accept the logic, so you're asking the question of then how to determine the sizes of them, right? If the size has been determined, it means that Decatur has to offer this much of goods to the followers to begin with. So, again, if the loyalty, because the W and S, they are predetermined. If you have a bigger S, then bigger S means that you have lots of selector rates. So you don't have to offer too much. So you can actually just offer private goods, right? But if you have a very small S, which might make W over S big, then you do have to, pay a lot more. So your question is like, it's determined by the ratio, and that ratio has been determined by some things that happened before the analysis. That's why it's called exogenous. So maybe it's not too early to say this. So in all these models, when we use model to explain the world, some things are determined endogenously, which means these outcomes are determined by the models. But some things are taken as assumptions. That's what we say, these are exogenous. So in this analysis, it doesn't tell you where and how W and S come from. It just tells you, given this set of W and S, how can you predict the level of public goods provision? So, I guess, I don't know. The question is, it's hard to answer your question through this because it depends on other things. And, right, I guess that's the best answer I can give you. Right.
Who's the Grossman that's referred to?
Gene Grossman, so he's another economist at Princeton. So if you are interested, he's another. Yeah, so let me show this, then we can take. Gene, Gene. So you know what? Right, this guy. All right, so see you next week, and let me know if you have any questions. Shoot me emails. I'll see you next week.